All right, let's take a look at web-safe fonts, learn what they are, how we can use them, and how we can prioritize the use of the different fonts. So here is a chart of the web-safe fonts. Here's the font name. You've seen many of these because most of the web uses these fonts because they're safe. And then here is a indicator of what category or type of these fonts belong to, and some samples. So mainly I want to go over this list. It's in alphabetical order. Take a look at these and talk about them and how they organize. Arial, Helvetica, Tahoma, Trebuchet, and Verdana I grouped together. I named because they are sans serif fonts. They are without serifs. This is French. The serif is the little decoration at the end of the letter form. You see that these all are clean. They just end and don't have any embellishment. Whereas the serif fonts, Garamond, Georgia, and Times, they have serifs. Like for instance, these little doodads that come off the ends that give the serif font a sense of character. The main difference to keep in mind here is that at distance, sans serif font tends to be more graphic, more immediate, and therefore more visual. Whereas the serif font often has the personality to suit certain types of long reading. Keep that in mind. Then there's a font type called monospace, and Courier is a good example of a web-safe font that is monospace. And what that means is that every letter, every character is the exact same width as every other character. You can see that that's not the case with some of these other fonts, like Georgia, a serif font. The I does not have a lot of width compared to the G. The G is much wider than the I, especially this capital G. But in Courier, the I is the same width as the capital C. So that's something interesting about a monospace font. And then there's the cursive font. BrushScript is an example of a cursive font. So there are a number of web-safe fonts. These are the safest of any fonts that claim to be web-safe because they are built into the browser. All browsers that ship and agree to interpret HTML also agree to have a certain number of fonts built into them so that the user of that browser doesn't have to have those fonts in order to see the web page and see its intended typographic design. So that is what we mean by something that's web safe. It's a font that that can't be misinterpreted. Now, as far as font type, I list this here because even though a font type is not a font, it indicates a certain style of font, and sometimes as a designer you might want to pay attention to that and use that in your design. So as an example, I'm going to open up a new pen and just describe how we might use CSS to prioritize the display of fonts. So I'm going to create a div. And in this div, I'll put some text in. And in my CSS, I'm going to now define this div so that I can create some rules on it. First rule is I'm going to make the font size a little bit bigger so we can, see all this stuff that we're doing. And I'm going to start by declaring font family, not with a font, but by the font type, just so we can see what happens when we use font type. If I say font family cursive, Look what happens. It's loaded a cursive font, not a specific cursive font, but any cursive font that is on my computer, the first available. So point one is that with the font family property, we can declare a non-specific font by declaring the font type. Usually the font type would be our absolute fallback. So if I use the font type to declare the font family, I can actually get a sense of what are the default fonts available on my computer. Monospace. Okay, see the monospace on my computer is, the default one is definitely not Courier. In the same way that my cursive was definitely not brush script. I think there's another one, Fantasy. Yeah, so Fantasy is another font type, and it's pulling up. I vaguely remember what that is, but these are all fonts on my computer. If you type these in to yours, in your CodePen, these types, a different font might show up. In fact, you should try that right now. Try in your CodePen Fantasy, monospace, serif and sans serif, just to see what is your computer loading up. Now the thing to know is that what shows up when you use these font types works on your computer, but it might not be the same thing as somebody else's computer. That's why we need fonts. Because if I want to say Arial, let's do this, Courier is the way to go. I need to define that. Something you can do in CSS is define priority. And by that, what I mean is you can say, well, I want Courier to show up, but if that's not available, then try a different font. And here's how you do it in CSS. In your font family, for the property, you declare your first choice font, then you put a comma, and then you put your second choice font. And you can keep adding commas. And you can have a whole bunch of favorites in order, generally ending with a font type. So what I've just written up here, what this means is the font family to display should be Courier. If that's not available, show it in Arial. If that's not available, show it in Helvetica. And if that's not available, find any monospace font available on the viewer's computer. That's what this means. And this is a very important feature that CSS brings to us and allows us to use in our designs. We can design with a primary font in mind, but also we can declare fallbacks in case that font is not available on the user's browsing device. And it could be different for different users. And that's why this is so useful and so interesting, is that we can declare a font and then we can go through a series of backup fonts to use to cover all the different cases of all the different kinds of people and browsers and devices that are out there. Now, if we're using web-safe fonts, these fonts that are on all devices, then the likelihood that someone will make it all the way down a priority list like this is very slim, especially if a web-safe font is your priority font. But what this gives you a chance to do is to pick a special font and make that your priority font. And then understanding the font type of that special font, choose a web-safe font as a backup, right? So, as an example, I have Avenir on my computer. I know it looks like this. It's a kind of a stylized sans serif font. There's a little bit of shape and character in the letter form, but not everybody has this. So Avenir is a sans serif font. So I'll declare sans serif as my fallback. But in between this, Avenir and sans serif, I have some options. Maybe I'll choose Arial. Maybe I'll choose Tahoma. Tahoma and Trebuchet. Maybe Trebuchet and then Tahoma. Actually, Trebuchet is Trebuchet MS. So it's going to look like this. Okay. So here is my rule for fonts in this div. Show any text in this div as using the Avenir font. If that's not available, use the Trebuchet MS font. If that's not available, use the Tahoma font. If that's not available, find any sans serif font. This would be an example of a well-formed CSS rule for font styling. Now let's take a look at this right here. Why did I put this font in quotes? This font is in quotes because the font name is got more than one word in it, and there's a space here. And this is important because if I don't have a quote to hold this whole phrase together, the CSS is not going to read it properly. The CSS looks at spaces here and thinks that there are different ideas or different information being expressed. So in fact, if I do this and I list it like this, likely Trebuchet MS will not get interpreted. In fact, we can check this. I'll just remove Avenir and set this to, let's do this as a good test. My font family, my priority font is Trebuchet MS. And the secondary font is Georgia. Oh, it actually looks like, well, CodePen is successfully interpreting Trebuchet MS. So good for CodePen. Let's find one that maybe will break. Oh, it's doing that too. So CodePen is very capable. It is recognizing that this whole, these three letters are a character, a phrase that maps to a specific font, and it's loading that up, and that's great. However, out on the internet, when we actually turn these into web pages, browsers are not going to be that forgiving. So that's why I'd like you to place a font name that has more than one word in quotes. If it's too confusing for you to know when to use quotes and when not to use quotes, you could just use quotes on all of your fonts and it would look something like this. Oops. Okay. So this is how to declare a number of fonts and set priority for their use.